Watch this.
They're here. Lawmakers in favor of public money for private education introduced their bill today to set up education savings accounts in Idaho. One of those advocates tells us why it's a big deal and a good deal for the Gem State. They're usually the first on scene in what can be a very traumatic scene. First responders are one step closer to more funding for mental health resources, but that help wasn't extended to coroners around the state, and they're not happy about it. First, she was kicked off the Boise City Council for moving out of her district. Now, questions about how Lisa Sanchez spent her campaign money are feeding more speculation.
Declining test scores, overcrowding, students not meeting grade level benchmarks, bullying, teacher wages, staffing shortages, curriculum issues, indoctrination, and the list goes on, are currently contributing to numerous frustrations with the status quo.
And so begins what will be the biggest debate in this year's legislative session. Republican Senator Tammy Nichols, co-chair of the Idaho Freedom Caucus, introduced the Don't Say Voucher Education Savings Account bill today in the Senate Education Committee. They released a sneak peek of the bill a week ago. And while it did have the same routing number today, it was only just printed. So we don't know all the nitty-gritty details of what was brought forward before that committee today. But in this early edition from last week, well, it kind of prompted some questions. Obviously, this topic will be the center of debates and discussions that will last for hours, and they will get into the weeds and cover the line-by-line minutia of whatever is written in this bill. We just don't have that kind of time here on the 208, and it doesn't really make for good TV. But for some answers, which we knew weren't coming from the caucus leadership, we decided to ask the Mountain States Policy Center. They're kind of a fairly new think tank in the area, but they've been advocating for school choice and education savings accounts for a while. And just in time for this year's legislative session, they put together this 20-page handout. Their take, school choice, vouchers, and education savings accounts are a good thing.
We've gotten away from concentrating on the kids. And instead, I think sometimes we concentrate on the adults in the system. Our point of view has always been what's best for the kids in the system. And that sometimes is detrimental to many of the children in the system who need extra help.
How much have you guys looked at this idea?
Oh, I've been studying it for the past 15 years.
And you think it can work in Idaho?
Yes, absolutely. It can work in any state if legislators are committed to it and if the school districts are cooperative with it. I mean, school districts stand to gain from this. I think there's a lot of fear that schools are going to be shut down. There's a lot of groups out there saying education choice means shutting down public schools. It does not mean shutting down public schools. It means making public schools better.
It does mean less money for public schools.
Not necessarily. It depends on the way it's set up.
The way the early edition of this draft is set up, it would take 80% of what the state spends on average per student away from a local public school and put it into an education savings account. That money could be used on anything educational, from tuition at a private school to after-school tutoring.
I mean, it is not just private schooling, it's not just homeschooling, and that's what education choice and an ESA is really all about. I mean, the money does not belong to the school. It belongs to the child's education.
But according to Idaho's Constitution, it shall be the duty of the legislature to establish and maintain a general, uniform, and thorough system of public, free common schools. Cargill argues that doesn't account for everyone.
If you're one of the 10 to 15% of students in the state right now who are not in the public school system, you're not getting a benefit from the state from that constitutional requirement.
Okay, let's talk about private school kids. History shows in any place that has these ESAs that 60 to 80% are the ones that are enrolling in this and basically subsidizing their private education. That it's not so much people who are jumping out of failing schools and then going to a private school, it's those that are already there. So how is this not just benefiting those kids that are already there?
Well, first of all, I would dispute the number 60 to 80%.
However, that's exactly what Arizona's Department of Education found this past fall, when their ESAs became universal. About 75% of their applicants were never enrolled in any public school prior. Cargill believes that would change over time.
If you're allowing kids or allowing families in certain areas of the state who may not have access to a private school choice option right now.
20 counties in Idaho do not.
Right. If you're one of those families, what we've seen in Florida and a lot of the other states that have done this is that the supply ends up coming in and meeting that demand. And what we've seen in other states is that it increases educational outcomes to a lesser extent, but still there for kids in the public school who stay in the public school as well. So it's a win-win for all of those categories.
How does that work?
So what ends up happening in a lot of the states that do this is you see the school districts improving because they're facing competition now.
Let's talk about accountability. And when it comes to private schools, they are not accountable to anybody. This says that's not going to change. Does that seem like that's the right way to do this?
Well, I would just push back and say they are accountable. They are accountable to the parents. If my son or daughter is not getting the education he or she needs, I'm going to pull them out and send them elsewhere.
You can do that already in Idaho.
Yes, but what you can't do is see a public school that is not performing be shut down. When was the last time you heard about a public school not performing being shut down? And the reason for that is because we keep putting money into a system as opposed to putting money into the kids.
Should we not just account at all and say we don't know what they're doing?
No. And in most other states, what you see with these programs is there are accountability. If you're getting accountability measures, if you're going to take the money, they have to meet accountability standards.
It's not in this one, though. This chapter does not permit any government agency to exercise control or supervision over any non-public school or homeschooling.
Mm-hmm.
A qualified school, it continues, shall not be required to alter its creed, practices, admissions policy, or curriculum in order to accept students whose parents pay tuition or fees from a Freedom and Education savings account.
I will say that I don't think this particular bill is going to be the one that gets to the finish line. I think we're going to see a lot of changes, a lot of amendments to it. I would be surprised if there's no accountability measure in there, just because most other states that have had this type of program do have strict accountability measures put in place.
So Mr. Cargill doesn't believe this is the final version we're going to see. It's going to be hashed out along the way, probably for quite some time. It is only January, and this could go all the way to March. And to be sure, we are going to speak to the other side of this discussion tomorrow morning. At least that's the plan. Some people, though, might point out that the biggest hurdle for an education savings account would be using public money to pay for private religious education. Our Constitution even forbids it with what is called the Blaine Amendment, named for a congressman from Maine back in the 1870s. He wanted to make sure public money, taxes, did not benefit religious organizations. Idaho adopted its version of the Blaine Amendment in 1890 along with its constitution. Proponents would point out it's a dead letter since holes were poked in such amendments by the U.S. Supreme Court over the last couple of years. Not calling them unconstitutional, but saying if you're going to allow money for secular private schools, you're going to have to allow money for religious private schools. There's already a push this session to repeal Idaho's Blaine Amendment. Cargill claims if an ESA bill passes in Idaho, in 10 to 15 years, we should see a system where every boat has been raised, public and privates altogether. Adding to that, he pointed out the state helping to pay for families that can't afford it to send their kids to private school would essentially be leveling the playing field a little bit. Leveling the playing field a little bit. While that kind of sounds like a finger in the eye of capitalism, isn't that also kind of the point of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right?
We are not backing down on education. We are doubling down on education.
And so if an education savings account for students to attend private school isn't exactly socialism, well, a grant for students to attend college must not be either, right? Well, unless you ask the Idaho Freedom Foundation, who called Governor Brad Little's plan to double down on education with an $8,500 grant for graduating high school students to use at a trade school or college of their choice. They called it crony socialism for big business. Today, that bill popped up in the House Education Committee. House Bill 24 expands the existing Idaho Launch Program to high school graduates. The money preferably will go to students going into in-demand careers based on the job market. Representative Megan Blanksma, who brought the bill to the committee, said this is an ongoing program, but like most things, what kind of cash it will take is ultimately up in the air.
It is an ongoing program, but all of this, as we all know, is completely subject to JFAC appropriations. So you can appropriate for a program or you cannot appropriate for a program. You can under-appropriate for a program. There's flexibility within the legislature to determine what the appropriation level is of this. And the current fiscal note reads as if it is appropriated at the maximum level.
It's not a woodpecker in the committee room there, just some trouble with the audio there. But House Bill 24 passed the House Education Committee 10-7 today, and it's going to go to the House floor for a full debate. Well, at one point, Toward the end of the hour and 45 discussion on House Bill 24, about an hour and a half in, Republican Representative Barbara Ehart from Idaho Falls took some time to explain why she was voting no on this bill and why she didn't want to give $8,500, a grant to a student to just go to college. And let me preface this by saying, you heard the technical difficulties. They were having a few technical issues with the AV aspect of this meeting, and it was probably fitting what Representative Ehart had to say began in the dark.
You know, we have students going to school and earning degrees that aren't market ready. That's an incredibly important point, and more emphasis should actually be placed on that. It's something that I've also addressed in the past. Why are we allowing our universities to offer degrees that don't mean a heck of a lot?
That don't mean a heck of a lot. Allowing our universities to offer degrees that don't mean a heck of a lot. She didn't give a list of those, but this is from someone who went to Idaho State University on a basketball scholarship and earned an English degree. And while Representative Ehart did invoke Chaucer in her statement today and acknowledged going to college for the sake of knowledge is a good thing, it's worth noting Ehart used her English degree to coach basketball and work at a gym in Idaho Falls. And did you notice the reaction of Representative Judy Boyle from Midvale in the background when she was saying that? Representative Boyle, by the way, went to 3 colleges, is now listed as a freelance writer and a rancher. Not sure what she majored in her colleges or if she even earned a degree, but the question is, who knows if it meant a heck of a lot or not?
It's a job surrounded by death. Coroners face the outcome of brutal murder, suicide, and even the everyday loss of loved ones can leave a mark. Yet when it comes to funding mental health resources for first responders, they weren't included. Even they are asking why. This is when we ask you to join the 208 conversation. Time to text us your comments about anything we've talked about on today's show or something you want to see on tomorrow's show. The number, 208-321-5614. Oh, and don't forget your name and the hashtag, the 208. And don't forget to stick around if you want to see yours at the end of the show.
As you can probably guess, debates at the State House and what's said during those debates, they seem to get our attention. But that's not the only thing. There's actually a lot of agreement happening because otherwise, well, nothing would ever pass. But in fact, the House unanimously passed a House Bill 18 today. The bill would permanently extend psychological workers' compensation for Idaho's first responders. Passed unanimously. It covered people suffering from PTSD and emotional trauma from the work they do. The only debate, though, actually came from outside the State House walls. Former Ada County Coroner Dottie Owens posted on Facebook that the law does not go far enough because under Idaho law, first responders, well, it doesn't include coroners, death investigators, or forensics that are involved in those cases. Owens says those people deal with some pretty, well, a lot of trauma, and a lot of it, the most trauma. But yet Idaho's laws don't give them the same amount of help. Here's Andrew Bartline.
First responders deal with a lot.
They see horrible, horrible things in their line of work.
But after an initial deadly scene clears,
You know, it's her entire life. It's her career.
Someone has to stay behind.
I had a family member, the mom called me on the anniversary of her daughter's death every single July for 5 years. So think about that. It times the call volume. If you have these family members calling for support, and I need to just talk about what you saw again. I need to talk about the case again. Can you go through the photos with me again?
Dottie Owens is the former Ada County coroner.
It's such a stressful job. It is. It's stressful.
But not stressful enough
will now have before it House Bill
to make the cut.
We would have ongoing coverage for these post-traumatic stress injuries for our first responders who encounter terrible and unimaginable things in their line of work.
In 2019, Idaho lawmakers passed a temporary law to provide workers' compensation to first responders. Today, the Idaho House unanimously voted to make this law permanent. But the law leaves behind key personnel.
It's unfortunate that coroners and forensic pathologists and forensic techs and administration in that office don't get to utilize any of those services.
Multiple times since 2019, Owens says she reached out to lawmakers to catch coroners.
Nothing.
Back up.
Crickets.
I agree with her concerns, and I think the next step should be to add coroners to this statute.
Representative Ilana Rebel sponsored both bills.
The first responders very much just wanted to keep their bill clean and just discreetly focused on their issue so that they don't take any chances that theirs goes awry before we start adding in other groups.
That's what I got 2 years ago. That's what I was told 4 years ago. If we add anybody to it, we're not going to get it passed. We got to get it passed, get it on the books, and then we can do the amendments. And so at what point do we get to quit amending and do something with it?
Rebel says first responders may have provided a roadmap where a temporary law shows the success or failures and then paves the way to a permanent solution.
It's going to be pretty traumatic. You're going to see some pretty awful things. So I think it does make a lot of sense to include them in this coverage.
But Owens says coroners have already been left behind for 4 years,
House Bill 18 has passed the House.
still begging for the coverage to leave their emotional trauma behind instead.
So why don't they get the benefits of the mental health part? It really devalues what we do in the field.
Representative Rebel says that in 2019, Brian, wasteful spending was a big concern among people who maybe weren't supporting this bill, this legislation. Well, over time, it's shown that about $500,000 a year is what it comes out to in the cost to provide these services, workers' compensation for psychological trauma to first responders. So showing that it's not a huge financial burden, she thinks has led to more support today. But Dottie Owens says there is a high turnover. People that do this job, investigators, like 5 years and they're out. Very talented people leave after 5 years. And she says if something doesn't change, she thinks it's going to be a very, very big problem down the road.
What I find interesting, too, about this is when it comes to guns and mass shootings and stuff, and the cry from a certain aspect of this culture is, well, we need to focus more on mental health. But then the time comes to actually spend some money on that mental health. Well, then it's like, well, I don't mean for everybody.
Yeah, and that's tough, too. You know, you broaden that tent, put everybody under the sun who might have, you know, some psychological trauma. Well, people might say that's wasteful, and then no. So it's maybe a catch-22 in a sense.
All right, we'll see if they keep adding amendments. All right, thanks, Andrew.
The cold Arctic air doing what cold air does and hanging tough. Hard to move out of here. Cold air more dense than warm air, and so it will tend to just sort of hang out near the surface, especially for our lower valleys over the coming days. That's why our temperatures are very slow to warm. In fact, today, still as cold as yesterday. 24 degrees for our high so far in Boise. I think that's probably where those temperatures stop for the day today. Teens down through the Magic Valley and through our mountain areas as well. Our current temperature is just slightly below that, 23 through most of the valley. 20 degrees in Mountain Home. So you know we're headed into the teens again overnight tonight. Not quite as cold as this morning, certainly not quite as cold as yesterday morning. So we're not headed into the single digits as we have a good deal of cloud cover hanging around to kind of keep some of the heat we got today in near the surface. Magic Valley forecast tomorrow doing better, probably climbing out of the teens. Partly cloudy skies in store for most of the region through central Idaho, including the central mountains. And there may be more warming that heads to the higher elevations above about 4,500 feet tomorrow with a temperature inversion setup. So for Long Valley, looking for highs near 30 degrees, but you'll also see for the Treasure Valley, temperatures looking very similar to those notes for our mountain valleys. 31 for a high in Emmett tomorrow, as well as Eagle, as well as Boise. That is still about 10 degrees below seasonal averages, but hopefully we can see a little bit of sunshine for the day tomorrow. Temperature inversion conditions, meaning some morning fog, some afternoon smog, and of course an air stagnation advisory posted through all of the gray shaded areas. That will continue until Friday afternoon, at least. As long as that temperature inversion holds, it'll keep our temperatures from reaching their full potential. We wait until Sunday for a more significant system to push through with a rain-snow mix.
Well, forced to move from her North End home at the end of last year, then removed from Boise City Council at the beginning of this year because that move put her outside of her voting district. You can certainly say Lisa Sanchez's year hasn't been stellar. And seeing how last year wasn't an election year, questions have been raised about how she spent campaign money in 2022. KTVB investigative reporter Alex Duggan dug into financial reports that showed Sanchez spent $14,655 of her donations last year on things that appeared to be outside the scope of campaigning, and a lot of it on food. Ada County Clerk's office is currently in the process of reviewing the filings after someone complained. So why do we care about this? Well, because the numbers look pretty bad when you consider from January 1st of 2022 to January 1st of 2023, campaign finance records show Patrick Bajent and former council president Lane Clegg, they didn't spend anything. Council member James Halliburton, he spent $18. Council President Holly Woodings spent almost $2,000. Lucy Willett spent just over $3,300. Even Boise Mayor Lauren McLean, well, she didn't spend much more than Sanchez with a total of $17,000, I should say. She spent $17,336. And those are all contributions, by the way, mail and payroll expenses. That's what they spent those on, not food. Sanchez's expenses include hundreds of dollars at different restaurants around the area, like Chandler's, Goldie's, and Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. Other expenses were from grocery stores and a gift shop and a candle shop as a, quote, general operational expense. And the list goes on. Idaho law says campaign funds have to be used for campaign-related things, not food. Former Boise City Council President Marianne Jordan said she was not aware of this level of expenditure in a non-election year and said this does seem weird, and the explanation would have to come from the person making those expenditures. Duggan reached out to Sanchez, but she has yet to hear back. All right, let's get to your comments here. Final minute of the show on a Tuesday. A lot of people had lots to say about the proposed education savings account bill that was proposed today in the Senate Education Committee. I can't wait to the day to see when the Christian nationalists figure out public education funding for religious schools will help fund Islamic, Jewish, Satanic. It went on and on and on. But actually, studies have shown that that doesn't really happen that often when it's used for such, well, I guess you could say kind of schools like Satanic schools and for those types of things. Kind of like the idea of like, if we allow same-sex marriages, people are going to start marrying their goats and stuff like that. It didn't happen. Those kind of things rarely happen. Not one thin dime of my tax money to go to the religious indoctrination of children in religious schools. That's one of their takes there. Maybe you shouldn't be in the Idaho State Legislature if you don't have a meaningful college degree, says David. This is all about Representative Barbara Ehart talking about how, well, maybe our colleges, universities should kind of only give degrees that mean something. School choice is segregation light. Rich kids will always benefit, and those with fewer resources will be stuck in underfunded schools, says Jenna, an educator in Boise. Like I mentioned, we're going to talk to the other side of this tomorrow. So we'll have the other side of this for tomorrow during the 208. And of course, this debate and discussion is going to go on for weeks, if not months. So stay tuned. We'll see you tomorrow.